Evening all. Let's have a look at a game just hot off the press, round 7. It's Nakamura playing white against Boris Gelfand. He kicked off with e4. Boris replied with c5, the Sicilian defence. After knight f3 we see knight c6, which is usually an invitation to go into the Sicilian Sveshnikov, an opening I absolutely loved when I was a kid and had some very good dynamic games with. d4 is played, none of this bishop b5, which takes the fun bit out of the game, the anti-Sveshnikov, the Rosalimo system. No, the open Sicilian here, opening the pawn here, for the Sicilian Sveshnikov to emerge now after knight f6, to force knight c3, encourage knight c3, and now e5, so after knight db5, we see d6. And the plan here for white is often to use this d5 square. After this knight comes back here, something like knight d5 or bishop g5. So we'll see bishop g5 was played here, a6, the knight goes back, b5 threatening to win a piece with b4. So the two main options for white here are knight d5 and bishop takes f6. Nakamura chose bishop takes f6. And black voluntarily accepts double pawns here. It doesn't want tempo gain on the queen with knight d5, so it accepts double pawns. Okay, so we have an unbalanced position where white has given up the dark squared bishop, but has damaged black's pawn structure. After knight d5, this makes way for the move at c3, followed by the knight rerouting, quite often like this or like this, to reinforce the d5 knight here. We see now Boris playing the immediate f5, and here, according to my opening book, the most usual move played in this position is bishop d3 or the move c3. c4 here is apparently a bit of a rare bird in this particular position, according to my Deep French 10 opening book. Okay, so black now plays b4, and white does have the option of queen a4 as well as what was played. White played knight c2. Let's not get it too much in the theory, let's get to the uniqueness of the game. Now f takes e4, and we're going off some beaten tracks here quite rapidly now. After f takes e4, I find a game played in 1998 where black won, Petrenko against Zatonsky. Okay, chess-based news. I just thought I might have something pinging in the background. I think it's my iPhone, pardon me. I'll just turn that off. So, okay, g3, bishop g7 is played, bishop g2, black castles, and after bishop takes e4, black doesn't want to play f5 immediately here, I think, because there's always discovered check possibility for bishop takes c6, which could be annoying. Let's have a quick look at the subtleties of playing f5 here. So if f5, although knight e7 is possible, maybe just bishop g2. Okay, maybe f5 is a playable move, as well as rook b8 here. So rook b8 was played. b3 now, which does slightly weaken the diagonal. It might be a little bit on the potentially dubious side if this bishop's going to extend its scope on the diagonal with f5 and later e4. This might be a slightly dubious move in some respects, but this b pawn will be a target, so it is cautionary as well, unless white wants to consider sacrificing the exchange on a1. But no, white wants to just get out of the way in advance of this to move the rook. So we see now f5, bishop g2, e4, hitting the rook. And here, maybe the exchange attack is not entirely convincing, but white could look forward to, at least with black without the dark square bishop, these pawns are kind of fixed on light squares. If we look at castling, sacking the exchange, although technically, obviously black is material up, this kind of position might be quite interesting to consider. It's just less than 0.20 from an engine point of view, but you see, without that dark square bishop, black without the two bishops, white's still got some opportunities here to do some real damage to black. But is it worth an exchange? Well, Nakamura didn't think so. He just moved the rook b1, but it is kind of leaving now this a2 pawn sensitive to this next move, queen a5, which seems a bit on the greedy side to try and nab this a2 pawn. Is there a downside? Well, the only thing shielding this d6 pawn is the knight. Once the knight moves, d6 is under fire, and in fact Naka castles. So after queen takes a2, he unveils an attack now on the d6 pawn with knight d e3, also threatening queen d5 check to pick up the knight. Queen a5 parries queen d5 check, but allows queen takes d6. So we see queen takes d6, getting the pawn back. And you'd think, well, it was a flank pawn here for a centre pawn. Isn't this more dangerous for black to have given up this d6 pawn? Okay, black now plays the forcing move rook f6. And we see queen f4. And now Boris doesn't mind the queens coming off here with queen e5, threatening to double white's pawns. So Naka takes that, knight takes e5. And it seems black's position is quite comfortable here by Sveshnikov's standards. Knight d5, okay, putting more pressure on b4, but with rook f7, b4 can drop because there's the potential for rook fb7 here to put lots of pressure on that b file and collect b3. So is b4, is it the right time to take on b4? Now this is a critical moment at move 25. Engines suggest f3 actually, with a slight advantage here, just trying to break black's pawn structure. This bishop's still hemmed in by this pawn. f3 might not be too bad. So for example, even giving up the light square bishop here, you see this bishop's not too brilliant. White's got this dominating knight on d5, which can be reinforced with knight ce3. So it might not be too bad, this position. But what we see here now is, curiously, knight c takes b4, which does seem to give black quite a bit of pressure now. And okay, you might think, well, rook fb7, as I mentioned, but there's also another approach here. Let's have a quick look at rook fb7. Doesn't quite work here. Knight takes a6, so it doesn't quite work, blocking in that pawn for knight takes a6. But in principle, this is going to be pressure on the b file, and that's made to work with a5 now. So the knight hasn't got c6 or a6, goes back to c2, and now rook fb7, avoiding that disastrous knight takes a6. And the pawn is pretty fixed with a5 as well. And it looks as though black's almost equal here. Although this knight does look very dangerous on d5, this bishop is shut in, and black's dark square bishop seems to be enjoying a nice diagonal. And this knight on e5 looks good as well. So we see knight ce3. And here, black's all of a sudden slightly better after this move. Maybe this is a slight inaccuracy. But maybe, okay, let's see. What can white do here? Rook bd1 or knight d4 may be a better choice. Even though, okay, what's happening after knight d4? a4. Giving up the pawn like this might be better than the game continuation, because what happens now, after knight e3 is black gets a very comfortable position, it seems. After knight c6, and there's an uncomfortable threat of a4 to get this pawn back. Let's see if rook takes b3 did any damage in this position. No, it falls victim to knight e7 check. And then taking on b3 to win the c8 bishop. So another little trap was set. Little trick was set by Naka, not to take b3 at the moment. So again, great caution now with this move knight c6, ruling out this tactic, removing this tactic. So renewing this threat of rook takes b3 or a4 is on the cards. But a4 would mean a very dangerous passed pawn, and without the a pawn being a liability on the a file, so that's preferable to rook takes b3. If that's, I think that's the main threat now, just a4. Now Naka plays c5. Okay. Now, if a4 here, let's have a look at a4 here. Then knight b6. So it's principally designed against a4 there to break this pin, and white will be doing, I think, reasonably well there. So here it's actually more effective to take with the rook rather than play a4 because of this knight b6 threatening to cut the rooks. So rook takes b3, and black, I believe, must be equal now in this position. Now he didn't take on b3, he played knight b6. So threatening the rook now. The rook takes on b1. Rook takes b1. And now after bishop e6, it seems very comfortable for black. White's in a pin. This pawn here is a bit vulnerable to bishop d4's here, which also is a bit menacing potentially on that f2 pawn. We see bishop f1, bishop d4, and rook b5 now, seemingly, very passive for Naka to have to do this. In this position, black might be tempted, it seems, by bishop takes c5. I'm not sure this does anything much. Rook takes b6. There's always knight takes f5 here. So caution again, not to try and resolve the position. He wants to keep his bishop here for a while longer. He just plays king f7. We see knight ec4, reinforcing the b6 knight. And seemingly nasty looking knight d6 check. That's gone out of the way actually with king g7. Now knight d6 is played in this position, and we see here actually that maybe again bishop takes c5 might be tempting, might actually be quite pleasant here. Let's have a quick look in this position. Bishop takes c5, rook takes b6. Does knight takes f5 work? This kind of position looks a little bit scary because of a4, but maybe white can just about hold this. It looks as though black's getting a clear advantage, though it's getting a bit on the dangerous side. Nevertheless, after knight d6, we see king f6. Not this quite committal bishop c5. Now knight a4, offering an exchange of rooks. So the knight on d6 facilitating. Well, also the bishop's protecting b5 anyway. But now we see quite punchy move e3 from Boris. Naka takes that, bishop takes e3 check, king g2, and king safety is being called into question here after bishop d5 check. This seems a bit precarious all of a sudden for the white king. King h3, because now after rook takes b5, okay, bishop takes b5, knight e5, black all of a sudden has potentially vicious attack with knight g4, king g5 and knight f2 threatening to mate the white king here. Naka plays knight c3, trying to remove one of the dangerous pieces, stopping his king going back to g2, and apparently this isn't so hot, this move. played at move 40. What to suggest instead of knight c3? It's a difficult position. It's becoming a very difficult position indeed. Knight b6, let's say. If the bishop goes here, it's very, very tricky. White has to harass these black minor pieces like this, but it seems, you know, black's doing very well. In the game, it seems knight c3 might be a critical mistake though, hastening here to the end here. Bishop f3, and these bishops are doing a very fine job. The king safety is very bad here. Naka tries to get rid of one of these pieces, bishop e2, but he could end up with a lost position if he loses c5, because we've got this running a pawn here. Although he can sort out the king safety, is he going to be landed in a lost endgame position? Black takes. For the tactic now, knight d5, not the routine capture on e2, but actually knight d5 check. But both moves are not particularly inspiring for black here. Taking back his piece, okay, but now after knight g4, if the knight dares take, there's bishop. There's quite a nasty surprise here. If knight takes g4, can you see there's a mate in one here? Ouch! Bishop f1 mate. Quite nasty for the king's safety still. So white has to be very careful. But it's a very tactical move in the circumstances. King g2, temporarily sacrificing the knight to try and regain it with king f2, carnivorous king. But unfortunately here, black can force a major simplification into an easily won king and pawn ending with knight c4. Naka has to resign here. This is an easily won king and pawn ending, because after king takes, knight takes. There's king f6, and we've got this outside passed pawn. We can stop this pawn or win it, and then the outside passed pawn will win. So Boris, with the black pieces, after knight c4, has defeated the great Nakamura, who was leading the tournament up until this round. Boris is now leading the Town Memorial. Well done, Boris, especially for the over 40s like me. This is an inspiration. Let's have a quick run through this game. Sicilian Sveshnikov, uncompromising play, uncompromising pawn structure. This c4 might not be, there might be some better moves theoretically in this particular position. If we do a reference check just very, very quickly again. Or is it bog standard? I regret putting reference there. Whoops. Okay, e takes f5. Bishop d3 or c3. This move c4 in this position is quite a rare bird apparently in this particular position. So, okay. So c4. Okay, so we see maybe a downside of the immediate c4. If black really is going to just simply take on e4, white has to take the time to recapture this pawn, one would expect. But he's giving black a very fine bishop on this diagonal. And that might seem like a small issue, but actually, the way this was played by black, he doesn't mind losing d6 for a2, because the rest of his minor pieces after this virtual pawn exchange here are not too bad in this position. Black has solved that backward pawn on the semi-open d file. So this position is already on the brink of being equal for black. Very, very carefully avoiding that little trap. You don't want to play rook. Not really a trap, just a specific note that can't be played immediately. Now the rooks can be doubled. And again, a little trap here, that knight e7 needs to be extinguished before rook takes b3 or a4, because of this winning the bishop here off the exchange of rooks. So extinguishing knight e7 check. So Naka plays for this knight b6 interruption if a4 knight b6. So instead rook takes b3 is the more effective way in this particular position. But the problem with c5, you know, it's on a dark square. Black's got the dark square bishop as a major asset picked up from the opening. So Black's starting to be even slightly better now because of that weakened c5 pawn. And again, no hurry expressed to take that pawn tactically to expose the knight on b6. Instead, some subtle king maneuvers getting to that time control at move 40. And here, you know, after e3, it seems White's king was in grave danger. You might think, well, couldn't e3 have been played earlier? Well, not here, because the knight's just come off, protecting against e3 there. But e3 in this position might not be too hot either. Well, as hot as the game. There's no bishop d5 check here. So I think that might be one of the key points. In the game, e3 seemed more effective because this knight's now just come off d5. So these bishops are going to be really complementing each other against White's king safety now after bishop d5. And this now becomes an issue after the rook exchange. And the king's in a very precarious location now with Black having that bishop pair. White is lost now. He's actually in a completely lost position. Finds himself completely lost in this endgame. Okay, so after knight c4, he resigned. A very interesting Sicilian Sveshnikov game. Well played, Boris. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.